Hello and Happy New Year, and welcome back to Baby Elias's Stories. We now return to Eve by Iris Johansen. Chapter 11. You're probably going to be very angry with me, Eve. John's voice. John Gallo's dark eyes looking down at her. She was lying on a couch. Red drapes at the window. Where were they? A motel? It may help to know that I made sure that you wouldn't have so much as a headache. Not a motel. She was jarred awake. She was jarred wide awake. She sat bolt upright on the couch. What the hell? It's fine, John said quietly. It may not have been the diplomatic way to go about it, but you're so surrounded by people who would have gotten in my way that I decided this was the safest way to handle it. She had a sudden memory of the numbing sensation as she handled the pen. A knockout sedative in that pen? No, it wasn't diplomatic. How the hell could it be? She looked around the huge room. A study, walk-in stone fireplace, book-lined walls, 4 floor-to-ceiling windows. And where the hell am I? My place in Utah. It seemed to be the safest place for a get-together. Utah? You knocked me out and bundled me off to Utah? You are crazy. I told you, he smiled, and you're not scared. How refreshing. You want someone to be afraid of you? It won't be me. Go screw yourself. I don't particularly want it. It just happens. So I use it. He leaned back in his chair. Now be quiet so that I can look at you. When I was masquerading as your friendly FedEx delivery man, I was trying hard to make sure that you wouldn't look at me, which meant I couldn't really look at you. She glared at him. You had plenty of time to look at me while you were bringing me here. How many hundreds of miles? But you were unconscious all the way here on the plane, and there was no spirit to be seen. What I remembered most about you wasn't on the surface. I want to see if it's still there. Just give me a moment. She drew a deep breath and tried to rein in the anger. She needed a moment of recovery, too. Shock and anger had blurred everything in their wake. She had reacted as she would have done if she had been the John Gallo she had known at 16. He was not that boy. He was a man, and one of whom she had to be wary. But she'd be damned if she would be afraid of him. Though perhaps there was a reason why he inspired fear. She thought as she studied him. There was a chilling quietness, watchfulness about him that she didn't recognize as a quality in the boy she had known. His stunning good looks had survived the years. Same olive skin, dark piercing eyes, slight indentation in his chin. Faint lines at the corner of his eyes told of time in the sun. A thin strand of white streaked the dark hair above his temple. His lips were the same except for a curve that was faintly reckless. Yes, he looked older, harder. The edge that she remembered had become dagger sharp. He weighed less, still muscular, but spare, whipped clean. Her gaze shifted up to meet his eyes. As you can see, I'm not the same person. Comparisons are impossible. We start new, John. On the contrary, everything I saw in you is still there, and more. He tilted his head. You had wonderful potential, and I didn't even recognize it. I was so dizzy about what was between us that I was blind to anything else. Potential? Don't be patronizing to me, John. He smiled. I wouldn't think of it. You were always able to intimidate me. Bullshit! Why? Because you always knew what you wanted and could stay the course. I had problems in that direction. He stood up and went over to the desk and picked up a silver carafe. Coffee? I thought you'd probably need a shot of caffeine after you came back to me. How do I know that there's not another knockout drop in it? He smiled. Because I have no reason. I had to get you here with a minimum of trouble from outsiders. So I put a trace of the fluid on the pen. Now there are no outsiders, and I'm willing to put up with any trouble I get from you. His smile faded. God knows I deserve it. He poured coffee into 2 cups. You still take it black? Yes. How had he remembered that little detail? I do too these days. A strong dose of caffeine and a glass or 2 of wine are the only jolts I allow myself. I don't care about your taste in coffee. Why have you brought me here, John? I thought I'd made that clear. Resolution? Nothing needs to be resolved between us but the question of whether you killed my daughter. Perhaps not for you. He gave her a cup. But you're saner than I am. I need more structure. He sat back down. Structure is important when you're tottering on the brink. Brink of what? Fill in the blank. He lifted the other cup to his lips. I've fallen into any number of abysses in my life. Some of them were hard to climb out of. And I'm supposed to feel sorry for you? No, you've had your own falls. He leaned back wearily in the chair. Who would have guessed, Eve? We tried so hard to avoid being trapped, yet it happened to both of us. Terrible traps. Mine wasn't terrible, she said curtly. Bonnie was the highlight of my life and always will be. You're telling me you didn't feel trapped when you found you were pregnant? No. I felt stupid and angry with myself, but I always knew that I could find a solution. Afterward, there was no question of traps or anything else that wasn't founded in love. She gazed directly in his eyes. Bonnie was all love. She bridged gaps. She made me try to understand myself and everyone around me. Do you realize what a wonderful gift that can be? And you've never regretted having her even after all the pain you've experienced. Regret? She lived. She lit up my world. He looked down into the coffee in his cup. And then she was taken away from you. Was it you, John? He lifted his gaze. No. She was believing him. She realized incredulously. No, she mustn't trust him. Then you know who did it? Maybe. Don't tell me that. Her voice was shaking. You have to know something. You have to tell me. I'll think about it. He sat up straight in the chair. Though it would probably be better if I just sent you back to your police detective. Did you tell him about me? Of course. He gave her a shrewd glance. Not everything. Details? No, he wouldn't be interested. I bet he would. How did you know about Joe? I know everything about you, Eve. He finished his coffee. One of Nate Queen's principal duties was to compile and update dossiers on you. I know about your lover, your work, and your adopted daughter, Jane McGuire. He smiled. She's a very good artist. You'll recognize one of her paintings on the wall as you go down the hall. She tried to hide her shock. She had naturally assumed Jane was not involved at all with Gallo. Why would you want to go to a gallery to buy her painting? Curiosity. I'm very inquisitive. It's my nature. And while I was in prison, it was developed into a fine art form. She's very beautiful. She resembles you. I found that odd since you're not related. Coincidence. But you didn't talk to her, ask her questions? He shook his head. I just stayed in the background and watched and listened. He paused. Just as I did with you. Why? Her voice vibrated with intensity. Were you ashamed? Was it guilt? There's always guilt. He stood up. We're all flawed, some more than others. He smiled down at her. And I'm the most flawed man you'll probably ever run across. I was starting down that path when we came together, and I went into overdrive after I left you. He headed for the door. Bill Hanks will take you to your room. I've confiscated your phone, and you'll find the house phones won't work without a code inserted. I want my phone. I need to call Joe Quinn. I won't have him worried. You can monitor the call if you like. Oh, yes, Joe Quinn. He glanced back over his shoulder. I'm very interested in that relationship. I think I need to explore it. And does that mean I can't call him? It might complicate things. You can join me for dinner in an hour and we'll talk some more. Or you can stay in your room and I'll come to you. Another stone wall. Who is this Bill Hanks? He's my head of security, companion, chess partner, whatever. His job description is as designated. He stopped at the door, but he's very loyal. You'll not be able to convince him to help you leave until I give the order to let you go. I'll find a way when I'm ready. She stared him in the eye. And that's not yet. You haven't answered any of my questions. I've answered the important one. You're just not sure you believe me. The only way I can start to do that is to know more about you. I didn't have spies peering behind bushes and invading my daughter's gallery shows. We have to be even. You always insisted on that. He opened the door. I'll answer everything I can. Feel free to ask Bill anything you like. I'll tell him that he's not to feel he has to protect me. It goes with the territory with him. He's been with me a long time. She hesitated. In Korea? Only the last part of my stay in that fine hotel. That's why I trust him. He avoided the final indignity. He smiled. He's not crazy like me. She stared at the door as it closed behind him. She was as confused and frustrated as she'd been when he walked, as she'd been when wakened a little while ago. She had to know more, damn it. He was holding out bits of information like carrots before a donkey. But he had said that it had not been he who had killed her Bonnie. It might be foolish to follow her instincts and believe him, but it was happening. And she was profoundly grateful. That would have been the ultimate horror. But he might still have been involved in some way. She had to find out. She had to know what he knew. Miss Duncan? A short, stocky man was standing in the doorway. He was 50-ish, with short, sandy hair and pale blue eyes. I'm Bill Hanks. His smile was warm and broad. May I take you to your room? John said you'd like to freshen up. Eve got to her feet. No dizziness, no after effects from the sedative. John had spoken the truth. Thank you. How courteous of him. After a kidnapping, it's always nice to have TLC. Hanks chuckled. I imagine it's difficult to compare kidnappings, but this one is top grade. John insisted that we do it right. It wasn't easy. We knew from Queen's reports that you were expecting the FedEx skull. but FedEx is a very efficient company. It was dicey stealing that truck from the lot when John decided he wanted to move quickly. Queen was monitoring my activities that closely? If he hadn't been, John wouldn't have been pleased. Queen doesn't like to displease John. He stepped aside and gestured for her to precede him into the hall. It usually has repercussions. What kind of repercussions? Unpleasant, Hanks said vaguely. So Hanks wasn't going to be entirely frank with her after all. She'd have to push until she hit a wall, then keep on pushing. Hanks indicated a painting on the wall. John said you'd want to see the painting. It's pretty good, isn't it? And it was definitely one of Jane's. Though she recognized the brush strokes and technique, it wasn't a painting with which Eve was familiar. It was a forest wreathed thickly in mists, and it was both mysterious and terribly lonely. Very good. She called it Lost, Hanks said. John said that she got it right. He was leading her down the shining cherry wood paneled hall. I think he would have bought it even if it hadn't been painted by your daughter. He said you adopted her when she was 10? Or she adopted me. We've never been entirely sure how it came about. She's very young to be so successful. Yes, she added deliberately. But it's not Jane I want to talk about. She glanced around the hall. This is quite a place, luxurious. John Gallo has money now? Hanks nodded. He always says that money has more power than an AK-47. He made sure that he was stocked with that particular ammunition. And how did he get it? He made the US government pay generously for his 6 years in prison. Then he took the money and did a tour of gambling casinos around the world and ran up his cash reserve into the stratosphere by counting cards. She frowned. How did he do that? Card counting? He taught himself in prison. He was always smart and he had a lot of time on his hands. It kept his brain sharp. It was real bad there. He paused. And it was one of the ways he kept himself from hanging himself in that cell. She could picture his desperation, the searching for anything to occupy the mind and replace the horror surrounding him. I see. No, you don't, Hank said baldly. You can't. I was only in that place for 5 months before John took me with him when he escaped. I'll never forget it. The smell, the heat, the pain. I still wake up in a sweat. And John was in there 6 years. She was silent, trying to understand the scope of that horror. He told me. He's crazy. Is it true? Hanks didn't answer directly. Aren't there times when we're all a little crazy? You're dodging. He said you might try to protect him. He has moments, uncontrollable fits of rage that's like nothing I've ever seen. John said that those fits are like those he's read about in histories of the Vikings. Berserker. They don't come as often these days. And Queen and Army intelligence know about them too? Yes, in the beginning, they encouraged them. Her eyes widened. Why would they do that? They aided his performance. He stopped before a bedroom door and turned to face her. After he got out of prison, they were still trying to use him. They sent him out on missions that involved assassination or extraction of personnel from hostage situations. His lips twisted. He was very good at it. Picture Rambo on speed, and that berserker bullet could cause him to go into almost superhuman overdrive. They knew he had mental problems and they still sent him out? John thought they probably wanted to get him killed with the least amount of trouble. He didn't care. It didn't matter if he lived or died during that period, right after escape from Korea. He had a bloodlust that wouldn't stop. All he wanted was the opportunity to vent it. Bloodlust, berserker, and that period right after he'd gotten out of prison was when Bonnie had been taken. I can see you drawing into yourself, Hanks said quietly. You wanted to know. He told me to tell you. When did he stop working for them? After a couple of years. Maybe he worked it out of his system, or maybe he managed to heal himself. They sure weren't going to do it for him. But he evidently still has a connection with them? Yes, but now the tables are turned. They don't use John. He uses them. And why do they allow it? He shrugged. That you'll have to ask him. I've never discussed it with John. There are some things I'd rather not know. It's safer for me. If I had to guess, I'd say he knows where a few very dangerous bodies are buried. At any rate, Queen jumps when John snaps his fingers. He opened the door. If you need anything, give me a call. How? I don't know your blasted codes. He smiled. I won't be far. John said that I was to take care of you. And keep me from escaping? His smile faded. It will only be for a little while. I think you're safe. Think? What if I'm not? Hanks didn't answer. John said you were loyal. That covers criminal activities. Why? Does he pay you that well? He took me out of that prison. He didn't have to do it. I had a shattered leg and a fever. He had to carry me a good portion of the way to the coast. He would have been safer on his own. He nodded slowly. Yeah, I'm loyal. That couldn't be more obvious. John had clearly bought that loyalty in a way that would ensure that it was unbreakable. Any more questions? Bill was smiling again. Last chance. One more. She met his gaze, bracing herself. Were you in Atlanta with John that month before my daughter was taken? He shook his head. I was still in a hospital in Tokyo. They practically had to rebuild my leg. I didn't hook up with him until almost a year later. But you knew about her? No, John never spoke about her or you until later. I never even knew he had a kid. The first I heard of your Bonnie was years later, when he was pursuing Queen to keep a dossier on you. You weren't curious? John sets limits, and I don't step across the line. You might follow my example. Her lips twisted. Or he might go berserk. He turned away. It hasn't happened for a long time. That doesn't mean it can't happen. He was moving down the hall. The dining room is back the way we came, and to the right. John has a great cook he hired away from a casino in Las Vegas. Those clothes on the bed are a loan from her. You're a little thinner than she is, but they should come close. Eve glanced at the worn jeans and oversized black sweatshirt with Mirage Casino emblazoned in white. They should be okay. Thank her for me. Thank her yourself. Judy's not shy about making her presence known, but she makes terrific Mexican fajitas. He slanted her a smile. And she's very loyal to John, too. Did he break her out of prison, too? I thought you said he hired her from a casino. He did. But there are all kinds of prisons, aren't there? She had a 3-year-old and an abusive husband. John sent the husband packing and brought Judy and the kid here, where she couldn't be bothered. Eve stood in the doorway and watched him disappear down the hall. Bill Hanks had been a treasure trove of information. but he had not alleviated her uneasiness. John Gallo might have become a man who deserved gratitude and loyalty in some quarters, but he was also an assassin and a man prone to violent fits of passion. She was still feeling the chill that had shaken her when Hanks had told her of those berserker episodes. Get over it. She had told Gallo she would not be afraid of him. She had to work her way through any fear and get to the truth. She turned, closed the door, and glanced around her. Comfortable, even, elegant room. Oak furniture, black watch played coverlet on the king bed, and a bouquet of intricate brown twigs in a gold vase on the carved chest. The decor had Western elements, but it was definitely not a designer room. It appeared too strong, too individual. She glanced at the plaid coverlet on the bed, a red plaid blanket on the grass of the reservoir. To John Gallo. She looked away and went to the wide window across the room. The sun was going down behind the mountains, and the terrain was spectacular. The red of the rock spiked with the verdant fir and pines made it appear that the scenery she was looking at was on some exotic and distant planet. It came as a slight shock to see that there were wrought iron gates barricading the house from the wildness of the terrain beyond. Barricades. She would have thought that John would shun any kind of enclosure after that Korean prison, but the wrought iron was open and airy. Maybe that was a compromise he'd had to make. But why was the house barricaded at all? Who was he trying to keep out? She turned away and headed for the door across the room that presumably led to a bathroom. She needed to shower and to think. She had been caught up with John Gallo, but there were other problems to consider. Even if Catherine had not told Joe about Gallo's phone call, he would know that something had happened to her. She would never have just gone off and let Joe worry. And what about Catherine? She had been joking about Catherine to the rescue, but Catherine would instinctively move to help her. Damn it. Gallo had caused her a monumental headache by acting with such arrogant recklessness. And that headache had nothing to do with the knockout drops he'd given her. She had to find a way to contact Joe and make sure he knew that she was safe and avoid any overt action. Fat chance. Joe never avoided any action if there was a chance he could take the game. He was already on edge, and this idiotic move of Gallo's would be the spur. And how could she convince him she was safe when she wasn't sure herself? Bringing her to this place had not been rational, and it was clear even Gallo's friend wasn't certain that he had come all the way back from that period of madness. And if he hadn't, then she'd deal with it. Gallo was her problem, and no one else's. She couldn't let that madness hurt Joe. The room looked more like a library than a dining room, Eve thought as she paused in the arched doorway. The walls were lined with as many bookshelves as the study had been. A fireplace trimmed in copper added to the ambience. Hurry and sit down. Gallo rose to his feet from his chair at the head of the table. Judy has been fretting about her fajitas getting cold. She's a perfectionist about temperature. Judy? Oh, yes. Hanks had mentioned John's cook. Heaven forbid I disturb any of your employees. She obviously rules the roost. Food is important. He seated Eve, then sat down again. I found that out while I was in prison. It's amazing how Deprivation fine-tunes one's appreciation of things we generally take for granted. Deprivation? The question had just tumbled out. She had not meant to ask him any questions about that period. I was a skeleton when I got out, he shrugged. But I managed to keep muscle tone. I exercised for hours every day to make sure that I'd be ready to act when I got the chance. Evidently that chance came. She looked around the room. I like this room. It has a sort of subtle richness. It's the kind of place where you'd want to linger and talk. His gaze followed hers to the bookshelves lining the room. She was surprised to see pride and affection in his expression. I like it too. I made the entire house into a haven. When I knew you, I had no use for havens, but that changed. You must like books. I don't remember that about you. I can't recall you ever mentioning it. He chuckled. Not surprising. We didn't do much talking, did we? No. She veered immediately away from that implied intimacy. And I didn't know much about you in any area. At the time, I was more interested in physical than mental exercises. He held up his hand as he saw her expression. I'm not talking about sex. I always had too much energy, and my Uncle Ted managed to channel it by teaching me everything he had learned in the Rangers. She nodded. Rick Larazo, I remember you saying something about it. His brows rose. You have a good memory. And she didn't want him to know that more was coming back to her all the time. She picked up her water glass. It comes and goes. What about the books? Another form of starvation. It actually was more intense because after a while, physical hunger diminishes. The mind doesn't give up so easily. I stole a Bible, a book of verses, and a copy of the Encyclopedia of Mythology from the effects of one of the prisoners who died in my cell. They weren't enough, but I was able to hone my memory and manage to develop other outlets, like card counting, one of the more profitable. There were others that were more abstract, but He broke off as a small, thin woman in jeans and a denim shirt came into the room. You're late, Judy. Here I've been bragging about you. I'm never late. She plopped the two huge covered dishes down on the table. I had to wait until you got in here to start cooking. If you'd been in here on time, I might have had a head start. But now, she stopped and tilted her head, studying Eve. I've seen your photo before, and you're sure no movie star like he sometimes brings here. No offense. These days, movie stars don't have to be glamour queens, but you don't look. Judy Clark, Eve Duncan, John said, and Eve is a star in her own realm. Skulls, Judy snapped her fingers. You do something with skulls. Reconstruction, Eve said. Definitely no glamour. Judy nodded. But solid work, good work. I have a 6-year-old little girl myself. I don't know what I'd do if my Kara disappeared. I remember thinking that it probably made those parents feel better that they at least know Miss Duncan. Eve, Mr. Hanks told me you had a daughter. She's 6 now? Yep. Judy's face lit up with a smile. She's real pretty, not like me, and smart as a whip. She's in the kitchen now helping me. Would you like to meet her? I'm trying to get her to be more social-like. She's kind of shy. An abusive husband, Hanks had said. That usually translated also to abuse toward the children. I'd like that very much. Then I'll have her bring in some more of the sauces when I bring in the tortillas. I want to thank you for lending me these clothes. It's very kind of you. No problem. They're not fancy, but like I said, you don't look fancy yourself. They suit you just like they do me, though I think John would. She stopped. I'll go get the tortillas. I'm letting the food get cold. She disappeared through the side doorway. Movie stars? Eve asked Gallo. Not often. I was curious. Another form of starvation? No, as I said, curiosity. I wanted to sample, not devour. He lifted the lid and steam ballooned off the fajitas. Like I do these fajitas. You should have waited. Judy had appeared with 2 covered plates. She was trailed by a little girl with sandy brown hair and huge brown eyes with extravagantly long lashes who carried a tray of condiments. You're too impatient. I keep telling you, John. Life's too short. John met Judy's gaze. Isn't it? An undefinable expression flitted across her face. Yeah, I guess maybe you're right. She set the covered plates on the table. Which is why you should enjoy the hell out of my fajitas. Eat. She pushed the little girl forward. Kara, this is Miss Duncan. She's a friend of John's. Say hello, honey. Kara stared at her gravely. Hello. You're wearing Mama's shirt. She was kind enough to lend it to me. I'm glad to meet you, Kara. Kara nodded. I wanted to see you. Mama said you were better than the movie star. A smile suddenly broke the gravity of her expression as she turned to John. How is she better, John? In all sorts of ways. John smiled back at the little girl. I'll explain later. It would take too long. Come along, Clara. Come along, Kara. Judy gave the child a gentle shove toward the kitchen. I'll let you help load the dishwasher. And then off to bed you go. Say good night. Kara looked over her shoulder. Good night, Miss Duncan. Good night, John. Good night, Kara, Eve said. Then the door swung shut behind mother and daughter. Eve smiled as she gazed after them. Sweet child, so solemn. And Judy's unusual. They broke the mold, or she broke it. That's more likely. Not the ordinary employer-employee relationship. I don't do employer well. I just have people who work with me. I don't have time for any other crap. He handed her the steaming plate and the plate of tortillas. Like I told Judy, life's too short. What were we talking about before she came in? Eve had to think for a minute. Books? He nodded. After I escaped and got some semblance of a mind back, I started collecting and reading. I like having books around me. You'd get along with Catherine's son, Luke. He has a passion for books, too. She unwrapped the tortillas. And for the same reason. I didn't know she had a child. How old? Luke is 11. She looked at him. I'm surprised you don't have a dossier on Catherine, too. She was the one who Nate Queen was dealing with. Oh, I do. But I guess he didn't think her personal life would be of any interest to me. He picked up his fork and added casually, or maybe he was protecting her. She was abruptly jarred. The conversation had not been ordinary by any means, but it had possessed an odd, almost comfortable familiarity. That last remark was not at all comfortable. Why should he think her child should be protected from you? He warily looked up. I said the wrong thing. Did you? Nate Queen knows more about you than I do. Why should a child be threatened? He shouldn't be threatened. His lips twisted. But Nate Queen thinks I'm capable of any atrocity. I can't blame him. I don't have a great track record. Against children? No, he said quietly. I've never hurt a child to my knowledge. You'd either know or not know. I hope you're right. I'd never do it deliberately. He shook his head. But there were missions and I was so messed up I didn't know what was going on. Sometimes I even blacked out. Sometimes for days at a time. I just obeyed orders and got the job done. And what if a child was in the way? I don't remember any... He broke off. What do you want me to say? Damn it, I can't be sure. Maybe I don't want to remember. His eyes were glittering in his taut face. His eyes were glittering in his taut face, and the words spat like bullets. You want to know for certain? Ask Queen if I ever murdered a kid. I'm sure he's kept a tally going off all the sins I committed during those missions. But that's all they did. They kept records. They didn't try to stop me. He stopped and drew a breath, obviously struggling for control. But that's not what you really want to know. You want to know about Bonnie. I don't believe I've ever had one of those blackouts except on a mission. I'd remember Bonnie. Why? You've never told me why you were in Atlanta. How did you even know you had a daughter? I'll get to it. He looked away from her. Eat your dinner. Judy will keep stomping back in here and yell at both of us. I don't care, but I do. He looked back at her. And you're in my world now. My world, my people. I'll give you what you want, Eve, but it will be in my own time. This isn't easy for me either. She had known her questioning had been painful for him, but she had not been able to stop herself once she'd started. Then, damn it, why did you bring me here? I told you why. Resolution? Bullshit. Maybe for you. His smile was slightly self-mocking. But when you're a touch unstable like me, it's important. When can we talk about Bonnie? Soon. He poured her a glass of wine. But now we'll talk about other things. Tell me about Joe Quinn, Eve. I love him, she said tearfully. He's strong and straight and everything I could want. I don't need phony movie stars to pamper my ego like you, John. He made a face. That evidently is stuck in your head. I admit sometimes I do have to reach to keep amused, he added soberly. I'm not on the attack about your lover. Life is rough. It can be lonely. I'm glad that you found someone to make you happy. I've tried, but it never happens with me. She had not expected that response, and it caught her off guard. She went back to the original subject. When can we talk about Bonnie? Tell me about your reconstructions. How does it feel when you're doing the sculpting? What kind of technique do you use to get such accuracy? She didn't answer. He smiled and lifted his glass to her. My world, Eve, he said softly. And no amount of persuasion was going to move him until he wanted to be moved. But she couldn't just abandon the subject, go along with him. She'd come back to Bonnie later. She picked up her fork. Forensic reconstruction isn't exactly light dinner conversation. He followed through immediately. Neither is stealing from corpses, prison, and starvation. In comparison, I think you're on the sunny side. He handed her the glass of wine. So tell me about your skulls.